Before we get started, I want to take just a moment to tell you how you can go deeper with these stories. If you enjoy Dauphin Island Diaries, you can support the show on Patreon. Patreon subscribers get early access to every episode, ad-free listening, and a monthly newsletter. Premium Patreon subscribers also get bonus content, including full-length interviews and behind-the-scenes material. You can find that at patreon.com/Summers Media Enterprises. Now, let's get into the story. Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. Out on the Gulf, you've got to follow the law. Yeah, there are important laws and regulations like Coast Guard regulations governing your watercraft, and you need the appropriate licenses for fishing and such. And you need certain certifications for particular occupations or even recreational activities. But I'm not talking about any of those. I'm talking about other laws. Laws that never make it into the legal code or any books of regulations. Laws that are far more immutable than the legal code or regulation books. I'm talking about things like Murphy's Law and the law of unintended consequences and the law of constant change. And there are probably dozens more that I could talk about, but those are all a good place to start, because for our story today, all of those laws drive a good bit of what we'll be talking about. Beneath the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, or if you prefer, the Gulf of America, there are forests growing where no forests were ever supposed to exist. Not forests of pine or cypress, forests of steel, of concrete and cinder block, limestone, old army tanks, sunken ships, oil platforms, bridge rubble, and enough old machinery to make parts of the Gulf floor look like Fred Sanford met Jacques Cousteau somewhere out at sea. Now, for generations, fishermen understood something important. Fish gather around structure. Even in my home state of Tennessee, people along the rivers and lakes will drop old Christmas trees or cut down trees on the banks of rivers to drop into the water because those attract fish. And in the same way, in the Gulf, if you put something on that otherwise featureless bottom, life just tends to show up. Nobody called it marine habitat enhancement back then. They were just trying to catch fish. Back in the 1950s, charter captains around Orange Beach and the Alabama coast began experimenting with artificial reefs. And to be completely honest, though it's not officially documented, that probably goes back even decades earlier than the 50s. But in 1955, the Orange Beach Charter Boat Association got permission to place 250 old car bodies off the coast of Baldwin County. Structure for fish. Those guys' livelihood depended on taking people out fishing. And those people that they took out came back again and again and recommended their friends if those charter boat captains found fish. So guys like Armand Annan placed those old cars offshore and marked those locations on their maps so they'd know where there were places that they could take people back to catch fish. It sounds pretty small and innocuous, at least in the beginning. Later came washing machines, culverts, buses, bridge rubble, And we'll eventually talk in detail in another episode about the Ghost Fleet. But to describe that briefly, in World War II, shipyards around the country, including ADSCO, the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, built massive numbers of Liberty ships. The Allies won World War II not just because of our militaries, which were formidable, but also because American industry was mobilized in a way that no one previously believed was possible. And part of that was the number of cargo vessels that our shipyards were producing to transport all those weapons of war, supplies, troops, plus provisioning the civilians of our allies like Britain and the USSR, whose own economies and manufacturing had been disrupted by the war. Our shipyards, like those in Mobile, built almost 3,000 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945 in nearly 20 different shipyards around the country. Well over 100 of those were built here in Mobile, and they were still being produced right up until the war ended, and then they weren't needed. But the government said, wait, don't do anything to those. We might need them later. So they parked them. The term commonly used is they mothballed them. And they did that on the Mobile and Tensas rivers upstream from Mobile, and they left them there for decades. They were called the Ghost Fleet because they were ghosts of their former purpose, and because some folks said the rattling and creaking they made as they sat there in those berths going up and down with the water sounded like ghosts. And then it turned out that we really didn't need them for future shipping emergencies like they thought we might. So after about 30 years, they set about looking for what they could do with them instead. And for some of them, you guessed it, they decided to make them into artificial reefs. And so in 1974 and 75, 5 of those old Liberty ships were sunk off the coast of Mobile and Baldwin counties. The Sparkman, the Wallace, the Allen, the Edwards, and the Anderson all found their new final homes and their new purpose as artificial reefs off the coast of Alabama. One of the most bizarre things, to me anyway, that was deposited to make reefs was old Army tanks. For those of you who don't know this story already, this may seem very strange. But beginning in 1994, as part of the ReefX project, over 100 M60 tanks were submerged off the Alabama coast in 70 to 100 feet of water. A weird part of me has imagined this, that in 1,000 years, those will have been completely forgotten, and someone will start finding them and think that Alabama fought off an invasion of its coast and that these tanks are all remnants of that failed invasion. And as with those old Liberty ships and with those old cars, the tanks and the other material dropped, the results were hard to ignore. Because once those things were in the water and had been there for just a short time, barnacles attached themselves to the metal, and sponges began to grow, and small fish moved in some cases nearly immediately. And then bigger fish followed. And over time, entire ecosystems formed around things that humans had simply dumped in the Gulf. And this is where we can talk about the law of change a little bit, because those structures dropped into the Gulf were themselves absorbed little by little into the Gulf itself. It's almost though, regardless of what was dropped or when or why, the Gulf wraps itself around those things and embraces them and assimilates them into itself. Thriving ecosystems began to adapt, absorb, and occupy those things that were dropped. Over time, as the sand and silt settle around those things, they become part of the seafloor itself. And the marine life that begins to attach itself begins to modify and mold the appearance of the original structure and to become more like an actual, no kidding, underwater reef. Fish begin to congregate around it. Marine growth begins to cover it. Barnacles take root. Sponges attach. Sometimes coral begins to grow. And it becomes less like a pile of junk or a wreck dumped on the floor of the Gulf and more like part of it. And over time, the reefs themselves began to be less of a hodgepodge of junk dumped off the coast and more like a system themselves. In 1987, a guy by the name of John Wynn drew up what was then an 800 square mile reef zone. He was a regulator in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Mobile office. And this was basically to keep the Gulf from becoming a ginormous salvage yard. In other words, less Fred Sanford and more Jacques Cousteau. And he began actually drawing this plan up so that these reefs could be governed and regulated. This is now managed by Alabama's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And the largest of those zones that now exist is named for him. And also his wife's ashes are actually embedded into one of those artificial reefs. Today, those original 800 square miles in the original zone have expanded to well over 1,000 square miles with 14 permit areas. One man that not only has embraced the concept of artificial reefs, but also has made a very good living deploying all kinds of reefs, is a guy by the name of David Walter. His company has been deploying reefs all around the Gulf and elsewhere for decades. And he wrote a book about it in 2019 called Reef Making, Transforming Oceans One Artificial Reef at a Time. In the mid-1980s, he had a small shipyard in Fairhope, Alabama, where he was repairing boats, and at that time, he bought a 45-foot craft. Local fishermen asked him what he was planning to do with it, and asked him to haul junk cars for him offshore to create artificial reefs, and thus began what was to become his actual career. Today, Walter Marine is still deploying reefs. The website for his company, reefmaker.com, boasts that Walter Marine is the largest reef builder in the United States and that they have deployed over 70,000 artificial reefs. From the early days when he was first dropping old cars, he's now patented reef pyramids and other structures that are constructed from limestone. And now all around the Gulf, artificial reefs are a thing. Not yet on the scale as off the coast of Alabama, but it's definitely a practice that's continuing to grow, and that likely is to continue to trend upward. In 2006, the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Oriskany, was sunk off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, to become what is currently the largest artificial reef. The Oriskany is interesting. Depending on what school of thought you follow, she's either a long-hauled Essex-class carrier. The Essex-class carriers were the fast carriers that took the war to the Japanese in the Pacific. Or she's a separate class called the Ticonderoga class. And this is because she was mostly rebuilt from her original design. Her keel was laid in 1944, but by the time she was launched, not fully completed yet. In October 1945, the war had already ended. And so construction was suspended, and then she was redesigned around the changes that were required for the jet age. She was then commissioned in 1950, and so she saw action in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And if you're a fan of the movie Top Gun, you know that the character Viper, who's played by Tom Skerritt, is said to have flown with Maverick's dad off of the Oriskany. After that Vietnam service, she was decommissioned in 1976. After being mothballed for a number of years, there were abortive attempts to sell her for display, and she was even due at one point to be scrapped. And then in 2004, she was designated to become an artificial reef. After she was prepped for that environmentally, on May 17, 2006, she was sunk in 210 feet of water off the coast of Pensacola, Florida. Today, she's known as the Great Carrier Reef. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on Dauphin Island Diaries, there's another show you might want to check out, The Tennessee History Nerd. Same approach, different setting. Stories from across the volunteer state, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, let's get back to our story. Off the Florida Keys, another Navy ship was sunk for the purpose of becoming an artificial reef, and this is where a different law came into play: Murphy's Law. In 2002, the USS Spiegel Grove, an LSD, that is a dock landing ship designed to transport and launch landing craft and amphibious vehicles, was sunk on Dixie Shoal, 6 miles off the Florida Keys in the Florida Keys National Sanctuary. The Spiegel Grove, which is the subject of an ebook, Diving the Spiegel Grove, Wreck or Reef, by diver and author Tim Grollemond, didn't play nice. A lot of things didn't go planned with that particular deployment of an artificial reef, of that ship being sunk there. In preparation for her sinking, the crews dropped her anchors and flooded her ballast tanks. But she settled too soon. And then she started suddenly to roll onto her starboard side. And workers had to abandon ship, and they were also forced to leave all their equipment behind. She actually sank hours ahead of her planned schedule and didn't go down in the fashion intended, actually coming to rest upside down at a slight stern-down angle. At significant additional cost, she was able to be rolled onto her starboard side, but not back upright to what had been her intended positioning. But nature basically said, y'all get out of the way, I got this. In 2005, Hurricane Dennis shifted the Spiegel Grove upright onto her keel into the original intended position. And today, the Spiegel Grove has become one of the most famous dive sites in the Keys. But it's also deep enough that divers generally need advanced certification to explore much of it safely. I'm no diver, and I likely never will be, so I'm thankful for people like Tim Grollemond who are divers as well as underwater photographers. Some of the photography from this site is stunning in its vivid colors and its beauty. Today, back in Mobile, workers are finalizing preparations to make the largest ocean liner ever built in the United States, the SS United States, into an artificial reef. There are still some attempts to prevent this, and in large part those are coming from heritage groups who would like to see her become a museum. And this is natural. She still holds the blue riband record for the fastest ever crossing of the Atlantic, and that was set in 1952 on her maiden voyage, when she made the crossing from New York City to Southampton, England, in just under 3 days and 11 hours. She averaged on that trip over 35 knots for the whole trip. But now, she's been gutted. This wasn't the Queen Mary or the Titanic. She was built for speed and utilitarianism and for safety. There was hardly any wood on her at all except for the piano and the butcher's block. Everything else was metal or asbestos, which of course was seen as safe in the 50s, but we now know about its risks, or was made of something else inflammable. One of her past owners sold everything off of her of value, stripped her completely, auctioned all those things off. So if it were possible to find a place for her to be a museum ship, and those kinds of places are difficult to find and expensive to secure, she's basically right now only a shell. She would have to be completely refurbished and refinished. And that would cost a lot of money. And there would be almost nothing original on her. Everything that would be on her would be a replica or a recreation. And so to do that would be prohibitively expensive. So I think that her final journey to become an artificial reef is, at this point, it's not 100% scheduled so far as I know, but I think it's likely inevitable. And yes, that is sad to think about. She was a proud ship. She accomplished great things. But I think this is her next phase. I think this is how she continues to have life ahead rather than going to the scrapyard. But getting back to that whole law of change thing, that law of constant change, she was built for a time that was already on its way out, even as her keel was being laid. Because before World War II, the way that the vast majority of people crossed the oceans was on ocean liners. And transport ships like the SS United States were built for the purpose of comfortably carrying passengers from continent to continent as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Celebrities, presidents, the wealthy, and also just regular folks needing to get from here to there rode aboard her between her maiden voyage in 1952 and in 1969 when she was ultimately retired. When she was commissioned in 1952, the SS United States was able to travel quickly and efficiently from continent to continent better than any other ship before her. But even then, not as well as air travel could. And starting in the 1950s, intercontinental air travel really came into its own. Previously, back even in the 1930s, flying boats like the Pan Am Clippers, like the Boeing 314, had made intercontinental air travel possible. But it wasn't really available yet to the masses because those were expensive and there weren't very many of them. But after World War II, air travel expanded rapidly. And with the advent of jet propulsion that was introduced at the end of the war, commercial air travel never really looked back. And that spelled the end for ocean liners as a means for the masses to travel intercontinentally, and the end for ships like the SS United States. At one point, the U.S. Navy considered buying her and converting her into a hospital ship, but that fell through when they acquired the vessels that ended up becoming the Mercy and the Comfort. And so the United States, the SS United States, languished through multiple abortive attempts to do something else with her until she was finally purchased by Okaloosa County, Florida, to convert her into an artificial reef. She was towed up into Mobile Bay, up past Dauphin Island, in early March 2025 to begin her preparation for that final journey. As of the original air date of this episode, she's still there, but basically awaiting her final sign-offs, and then she'll be on her way. And when that happens, she'll surpass the Oriskany as the largest artificial reef in the world. The Oriskany is 912 feet long. The SS United States is 990 feet long. So the folks in Destin and Fort Walton Beach will be excited to have her in the waters offshore there. But even then, back in the Alabama waters, the artificial reef system has become one of the largest and most productive in the world. But here's where the story gets more complicated, because artificial reefs didn't just create new habitat. They also changed existing habitat. That's the part that we leave out sometimes or neglect to consider. To a fisherman chasing snapper or amberjack, artificial reefs might look like a tremendous success story, but to somebody studying soft-bottom ecosystems, maybe not so much. Because before the reefs, those sandy bottoms weren't empty. They supported shrimp grounds, worms, crabs. Soft-bottom marine life adapted to that environment. And once you start changing structure, you start changing everything else too. When most people picture the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, they imagine coral reefs like the Florida Keys. But much of the northern Gulf doesn't look like that at all. A lot of it's flat, sand, mud, low relief. And so then as one kind of fishing thrives around the artificial reefs like snapper, those that were better supported by the wide open flat sandy bottoms like shrimp begin potentially to be affected. And this is where we see the last of those laws that we'll talk about, the law of unintended consequences. Because along the Gulf Coast, that's a principle you see over and over again. Change one thing, and something else changes with it that you didn't mean to change. That pattern repeats itself all across the Gulf Coast over and over again. The Intracoastal Waterway improved shipping and commerce, but it also altered salinity and water flow in places. And as mentioned in our previous episode, Bon Secours Bay and Mississippi Sound once supported oyster beds far more extensive than what exists today. Over time, changing conditions made those environments less favorable for oysters than they once were. Change one thing, and sometimes it almost becomes a domino effect of things that change down the line. Certainly, it's true that you rarely change something to get an effect that you desire without impacting something else. Sometimes positive, sometimes not. And probably few stories illustrate that concept better than the history of artificial reefs. With the introduction of the artificial reefs and of the structure that draws fish to congregate, there's come a fish that isn't native to the area and is not desired. An aggressive fish that's native to the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Red Sea, but which has been increasingly showing up in the Atlantic, including in the Gulf of Mexico, is the lionfish. They thrive in a lot of different kinds of environments, and they reproduce at an unbelievable rate. They grow fast, eat a lot, and have very few natural predators in this part of the world. Because of these factors, wherever they appear, they're pushing the native fish out. On one hand, the reefs are giving the native fish additional places to flourish, but they're also increasingly becoming home to the non-native lionfish. And then there are the oil and gas platforms. These are maybe the strangest unintended reef system of all. Thousands of structures built for petroleum and natural gas extraction accidentally became giant vertical ecosystems rising up out of the Gulf floor. Barnacles, corals, sponges, snapper, amberjack, sea turtles, even migratory birds stopping to rest during crossings over the Gulf. The platforms were never intended to become reefs, but nature adapted anyway. Scientists studying the platforms have begun referring to them as vertical reefs, and in many ways, that's exactly what they've become. Sometimes when you mess something up, you have to try to fix it as best you can. As we noted earlier, one of the things that happened when the intracoastal waterway was created was that the dredging necessary to deepen those channels destroyed almost overnight the oyster beds that it took centuries for nature to create and perfect. And so there are even artificial reefs to help with that issue. If you remember us talking earlier about David Walter, one of the kinds of artificial reefs that his company now builds are for estuarial enhancement, for helping to rebuild oyster reefs that have declined or been destroyed, especially through the activities of people that have created those unintended consequences. But ultimately, with the story of artificial reefs, what the Gulf shows us is that it will heal itself. Artificial reefs show us that it can take what man does and use it to create new ecosystems. It's another example of the Gulf Coast constantly reinventing itself. And maybe that's really the larger story here. The Gulf Coast has always been changing. Storms change it. Rivers change it. Industry changes it. Shipping changes it. Tourism changes it. People change it. Sometimes intentionally. Sometimes accidentally. And sometimes life simply adapts afterwards. Because beneath the waters of the Gulf, nothing ever really stays still for long. And that's going to do it for this episode of Dauphin Island Diaries. In our next episode in a couple of weeks, we'll be taking something we talked about today and looking at it a little more closely, the oyster industry on Dauphin Island and in the region around it. I hope you'll be watching for that episode to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. Before we close things up completely for today's episode, I wanted to share with you a bit about where I got the information I used for today's discussion. Special attention was given to the work of David Walter and his book, Reef Making, Transforming Oceans One Artificial Reef at a Time, along with materials from Walter Marine and reefmaker.com concerning the development of artificial reefs along the Alabama Gulf Coast. Additional research came from Outdoor Alabama and the Alabama Marine Resources Division regarding the history, ecology, and development of Alabama's artificial reef system. Research and background material also came from Noema Magazine's article, The Booming Business of Alabama's Artificial Reefs, which explored both the economic and ecological debates surrounding reef building in the Gulf. Attention was also given to Mary Kay Wixton's Vertical Reefs, Life on Oil and Gas Platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, which examines the ecosystem that formed around offshore oil platforms and their role as unintended artificial habitats. Additional materials and background research included resources related to the USS Spiegel Grove, invasive lionfish, Gulf Coast ecology, shoreline change, and reef restoration efforts. I'm very thankful for all of these resources, for their information, and for the effort spent in research and documenting this information. As always, if you're interested in doing a deeper dive into this topic, I encourage you to check out these guys and the material they produced. Once again, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's more where this came from. Over on Patreon, you'll find our full catalog, plus you can get early access to episodes, ad-free listening, and bonus content that goes beyond what's included here. Signing up for a paid subscription to Patreon is the best way to support the show and to get more out of it at the same time. That's patreon.com/Summers Media Enterprises. And thanks for listening.